The sun over Purgatory Point was a merciless, white-hot coin in a bleached blue sky. It baked the cracked earth, shimmered above the canvas tents, and drew the stink of sweat, cheap whiskey, and despair from the 100 or so souls gathered in this lawless pocket of the territory. It was a place where men came to lose themselves and sell whatever they had left, be it a lame horse, a stolen watch, or a human life. Today, it was a life. Her name was Lillian. She stood on a makeshift auction block, 3 whiskey barrels nailed together, her wrists loosely bound with a piece of frayed rope. The dust had settled into the folds of her worn dress, matting her dark hair and clinging to her eyelashes. She didn't look at the crowd, a leering assembly of miners, drifters, and failed ranchers. Instead, her gaze was fixed on the distant, jagged line of the mountains, her expression a mask of such profound indifference, it was more unsettling than tears. She possessed a stillness that didn't belong here, a spine made of prairie steel hidden beneath the grime. The auctioneer, a man with a greasy vest and a voice like gravel grinding together, held up a clay jug. Look at her, gentlemen, young, healthy, and quiet. What more could a man ask for? All she'll cost you is a taste of this fine Kentucky wine. He took a swig, letting it dribble down his chin. Who'll start the bidding? 2 barrels for the girl. A grimy hand shot up from the crowd. 2. I hear 2. Do I hear 3 for this desert flower? From the edge of the crowd, Caleb watched, half hidden in the sliver of shade offered by the blacksmith's lean-to. He hadn't meant to stop. Purgatory Point was a stain on the map he preferred to ride around, but his horse had thrown a shoe. He was a tall man, built lean and hard, like the land itself. His face was all angles and sun-weathered lines, his eyes the color of a stormy sky, holding a weariness that had nothing to do with the miles he'd traveled. The Colt peacemaker on his hip rested with a familiar, heavy patience. He had seen ugliness in every form it could take, but the sight of the girl on the block, her quiet defiance a flickering candle in a hurricane of degradation, stirred something dormant in his chest. It was a cold, familiar ache, the ghost of a debt he could never fully repay. 3 barrels, another voice shouted, followed by a ripple of coarse laughter. The auctioneer's eyes glinted. 3 it is, a bargain at twice the price. Going once. Caleb pushed himself off the wall. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His movement alone was enough to draw a few eyes, his presence carrying a weight that parted the crowd as he walked forward. The dust puffed up around his worn boots. He stopped 20 feet from the block, his expression unreadable. The auctioneer squinted at him. Well now, stranger, you aimin' to make a bid, or just blockin' the view? Caleb ignored him. His gaze met Lillian's for the first time. He expected to see fear, or pleading. He saw neither. Her eyes, a deep and startling shade of green, held his with a cool, challenging fire. It was the look of a trapped animal that would sooner chew off its own leg than lick the hand that offered it a scrap of meat. What's the price on her? Caleb's voice was low, a dry rasp that cut through the midday heat. The auctioneer chuckled, sensing a bigger payout. This ain't a general store, friend. It's an auction. Highest bid takes the prize. We're at 3 barrels of Kentucky's finest. Caleb's gaze didn't waver from Lillian's. He slowly raised a gloved hand, not in a bid, but pointing a single finger toward the vast, unforgiving sky. The crowd murmured, confused. The auctioneer frowned. What in blazes is that supposed to mean? That's my price, Caleb said, his voice as steady as the rock of the mesas. 1 prayer. For your damned soul. For what you're doing here today. He let the words hang in the hot, silent air. And this. He reached into his saddlebag, pulling out not a bag of coins, but a heavy, gleaming bar of silver. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more real, more substantial than a promise of sour wine. He tossed it onto the dusty ground in front of the block. It landed with a dull, final thud. The silence that followed was absolute. The silver bar seemed to suck all the sound from the air. The auctioneer stared at it, his greed warring with his confusion. The men in the crowd looked from the silver to Caleb, taking in the set of his jaw, the way his hand hovered near the butt of his Colt, and they understood this was no longer a negotiation. The auctioneer swallowed hard, his bravado gone. He scurried forward, snatched the silver, and gestured to one of his cronies. "Cut her loose." The rope fell away from Lillian's wrists. She rubbed them, her eyes never leaving Caleb. He had saved her, paid a price for her. But as he turned and walked toward his horse, gesturing for her to follow, he was met not with gratitude, not with relief, but with the cold, unyielding steel of her defiant gaze. She did not move. It was clear she saw this not as a rescue, but as a transfer of ownership. He had pointed to the sky, but she was still standing in hell, and as far as she was concerned, he was just another one of its wardens. The journey ahead, he knew then, would be paid for not in silver, but in a silence as vast and hostile as the desert itself. They moved east, away from the festering wound of Purgatory Point. Caleb led his horse, a powerful roan, while Lillian walked a few paces behind him, a silent shadow against the ochre dust. He had offered her the saddle, but she had refused with a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. The refusal was her only weapon, silence her only shield. For 2 days, the only sounds that passed between them were the plod of hooves, the creak of saddle leather, and the whisper of the wind through sagebrush. The land was a brutal canvas of rock and heat. Canyons slashed through the plains like old wounds, and the sun beat down with a physical weight. Caleb navigated it with an innate sense of direction, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, reading the terrain like a book he knew by heart. He was patient. He knew that forcing her to talk would be like trying to dam a river with his bare hands. It would only build the pressure until it broke in a way neither of them wanted. He left a canteen of water and a piece of jerky for her on a rock when he stopped. Turning his back to give her the illusion of privacy, he saw, from the corner of his eye, that she ate and drank, her movements efficient and sparing. She was a survivor. He wondered what had happened to her, what had forged such a hard shell around a spirit that burned so fiercely in her eyes. On the 3rd day, the sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The air grew heavy and still. Caleb stopped, tasting the air. "Get ready," he said, the first words he'd spoken directly to her in nearly 48 hours. "It's a blow coming." Before Lillian could process his warning, the world erupted. The wind hit them like a physical blow, a solid wall of sand and grit that stole their breath and visibility. The sky went from yellow to a churning, angry brown. The roan whinnied, its eyes wide with panic, and reared back. Caleb grabbed for the reins, but the horse, maddened by the stinging sand, broke free. It bolted, a phantom shape swallowed by the storm, carrying with it their bedrolls, the bulk of their food, and, most critically, the large water skin. "No!" The word was torn from Lillian's throat, a raw cry of despair. Caleb was already moving, his bandana pulled up over his nose and mouth. "This way! To the rocks!" he yelled over the roar of the wind, grabbing her arm. His grip was firm, impersonal, a simple anchor in the chaos. For a moment, she resisted, her instinct to pull away from his touch warring with the primal need to survive. But the wind ripped at her, trying to tear her from the earth, and she stumbled, yielding. He half dragged, half-guided her toward a low-lying outcrop of rock he'd noted earlier. They huddled in the lee of the stone, the wind howling over them like a freight train. Sand blasted against the rock, sounding like 1,000 tiny hammers. They were trapped in a swirling vortex of grit and noise, the world reduced to this small, inadequate shelter. Hours passed. The storm raged without mercy, huddled together. The silence that had defined their journey was replaced by a forced, non-verbal intimacy. In the maelstrom, he saw a tremor run through her, a human response to the terrifying power of nature. He shrugged off his heavy duster and, without a word, draped it over her shoulders. It smelled of dust, leather, and him. She stiffened, but then pulled it tighter, the simple warmth a temporary truce. As the wind began to abate, a new, more immediate crisis settled in. They were alive, but they were stranded. No water, no food, and a horse lost to the wilderness. It was in this shared desperation that he saw another side of her. When the last of the wind died down, leaving an eerie, dust-choked silence, she was the first to speak, her voice raspy. The horse went northeast. It will look for water. A wash. Maybe a creek bed. Caleb looked at her, surprised by the certainty in her tone. You know this land? I know animals, she replied, her gaze distant. And I know thirst. They started walking, following the faint tracks the roan had left before the worst of the storm obliterated them. As they crested a small rise, Caleb suddenly stopped, his body going rigid. He let out a low hiss of pain, leaning against a rock. Lillian followed his gaze down to his left calf. A dark stain was spreading across his trousers from a gash just below the knee, torn open by a sharp rock during their scramble for shelter. It's nothing, he grunted, trying to straighten up. It's not nothing, she said, her voice devoid of pity, but full of practicality. In this heat, it'll fester before sundown. Sit. It was an order, not a request, wary but seeing the sense in it. Caleb lowered himself to the ground. Lillian knelt and, without hesitation, ripped a long strip from the hem of her already worn dress, as she began to clean the wound with a small amount of precious water from his personal canteen, her fingers surprisingly gentle. The fabric of his trousers fell away from a much older injury. Just above the new gash was a puckered, silver-white scar. It was a vicious, ugly thing, the kind a man gets from a Bowie knife in a fight to the death. It was a map of a past violence he tried to keep hidden. Lillian's fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second as she saw it, her touch tracing its edge ever so lightly. Her eyes met his, and in that moment, the canyon between them shrank. She had seen a piece of his history, a piece he hadn't chosen to show her. He didn't pull away. He simply watched her, his own stormy eyes shadowed with memories. She said nothing, but her touch was no longer just practical. It was understanding. She finished bandaging the new wound over the old scar, her silence now holding a different quality. It was no longer a weapon, but a space where unspoken truths could finally breathe. The dust storm had scoured the landscape, leaving it raw and exposed, much like the two figures trudging through it. Caleb's limp grew more pronounced with every mile, the throb in his leg a steady, unwelcome rhythm. The sun, having returned with a vengeance, was beginning to set, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. It was Lillian who spotted it first, a dark shape against the horizon, a silhouette of crumbling adobe walls and a broken bell tower. "A mission," she said, her voice hoarse. "There might be a well." Hope was a dangerous thing in this land, but it was all they had. It took them the better part of an hour to reach it, the last of the light failing as they stumbled into the relative sanctuary of its courtyard. The mission of San Alma was a ghost of a place. The roof of the chapel had collapsed long ago, and weeds choked the flagstones. But the thick adobe walls still stood, offering a barrier against the vast, empty night. And there, in the center of the courtyard, was a stone well. Caleb worked the stiff, groaning pulley, and a moment later, the bucket came up, heavy and dripping with clean, cold water. They drank deeply, the water a blessing that washed away the dust and fear of the day. The relief was so profound, it left them momentarily weak. As darkness fell, a new kind of storm gathered. The temperature plummeted, and the wind, which had been their enemy all day, returned with a bitter, chilling edge. They took refuge in what might have been the sacristy, a small room with 3 solid walls and a ceiling that was mostly intact. Caleb managed to gather enough dry mesquite from the sheltered corners of the ruins to build a small, cautious fire. The flames pushed back the oppressive darkness, casting flickering shadows on the crumbling walls and on their faces. The forced proximity of the storm had been one of necessity. This was different. This was a shared space, a small pocket of warmth carved out of the immense, cold wilderness. The silence returned, but it was charged with the unspoken questions that lay between them. The duster he had given her was still draped over her shoulders. Caleb broke the silence, his voice low and rough. "You were right. About the horse." Lillian stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in her green eyes. "It was just sense." "Not everyone has it," he said. He shifted, wincing as he put weight on his injured leg. The pain was making him talkative, chipping away at his usual stoic reserve. "You never told me your name." She was quiet for a long moment. He thought she wouldn't answer. Then, so softly, he almost didn't hear it over the crackle of the fire, she said, "Lillian." "Caleb," he replied, a simple exchange that felt monumental. They sat for a while longer, the fire a silent third companion. He watched her, the way the firelight softened the hard lines of defiance on her face, revealing a weariness that went bone deep. He saw the faint pale line on her left ring finger, the ghost of a ring that had been worn for a long time. He said nothing about it. "Why?" she asked suddenly, her eyes still on the flames. "The silver. The prayer. Why did you do it?" Caleb looked down at his hands, the knuckles scarred, the fingers long and calloused. He thought of the scar on his leg, of other scars, other debts. "I owed a prayer," he said, the words tasting like ash. "To someone I couldn't save." He offered no more, the statement a locked door he had no intention of opening. She seemed to accept this. The firelight danced, and in its glow, he saw her defenses beginning to crumble, not from his pressure, but from the weight of her own story. "I wasn't born to this," she said, her voice a near whisper. "Before, I had a home, a father, books." The word hung in the air, full of a world they had both left behind. "My mother taught me about herbs, about healing. She said the land gives you the cure for the wounds it inflicts, if you know where to look." Here it was, a piece of her past, freely given. He listened, his entire being focused on her words. "We had land, near the Cimmerian River," she continued, her voice gaining a strange, detached strength, as if she were telling someone else's story. "My father was a proud man, too proud. He made arrangements to protect his name, his legacy." She finally looked at him, and her eyes were not filled with sadness, but with a cold, clear anger that was more potent than any grief. "I was part of the arrangement, a piece of property to be traded. That's what I learned at Purgatory Point. Not that I could be sold, but that I already had been." She didn't say who sold her. She didn't say why. But the betrayal she spoke of was not that of a stranger or an enemy. It was the deep, serrated wound that could only be inflicted by family. Caleb felt the truth of it settle in his gut. A cold, heavy stone. He now understood the source of her defiance. It wasn't him she was fighting. It was the ghost of the man she had been forced to become in order to survive the person she used to be. The storm outside had passed, but in the small, fire-lit room, the air was thick with the storm that had just been unleashed within, leaving the ruins of the San Alma mission behind. A fragile understanding had taken root between them. They had found Caleb's roan near a shallow creek, just as Lillian had predicted, and with it, a renewed chance at reaching civilization. They rode for 2 days toward the town of Redemption, a name that felt like either a promise or a cruel joke. Caleb knew the town. It was a place where a man could get a hot meal, a stiff drink, and, if he wasn't careful, a knife in the back. For him, it was a place of ghosts. As they rode down the dusty main street, past the saloon and the land office, Caleb felt a familiar tension coil in his gut. Men on the boardwalk stopped to watch them, their eyes lingering on Lillian. But some of the gazes that fell on Caleb were different. They held a flicker of recognition, of fear. He kept his face impassive, his hand resting near his Colt, a habit as natural as breathing. They stopped at the livery stable. As Caleb was paying the stable boy, a voice cut through the air, slick with malice. "Well, I'll be damned." The butcher of Black Creek Gorge himself. Caleb froze. The name hit him like a physical blow, a brand seared into his soul that he thought he had hidden from the world. He turned slowly. Leaning against the saloon doors was a man named Jedediah, Jed Stone. He was wiry and mean, with pale, reptilian eyes. Caleb had known him years ago, back when they rode for the same ruthless cattle baron, back when Caleb was a different man. "Jed," Caleb said, his voice flat and cold. "You're a long way from home." "Not as far as you, butcher," Jed sneered, pushing himself off the doorway and taking a few steps closer. A hush fell over the street. Townsfolk who had been milling about now found reasons to step into doorways, their curiosity warring with their instinct for self-preservation. "Heard you'd gone soft. Found God. Maybe. Or just lost your nerve." Lillian, who had been tending to the horse, straightened up, her eyes wide. She looked from Jed's leering face to Caleb's stony profile. The man who had spoken of prayers and debts, who had shown her a quiet compassion, was being called a butcher. "I'm just passing through. Jed," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. He didn't want this. Not here. Not in front of her. "Let's leave it at that." Jed laughed, a high, grating sound. "I don't think so. See, the boys and I were at Black Creek Gorge. We remember how you were, cold as a winter snake. You gave the orders. We just followed." He gestured with his chin toward Lillian. "Who's this? Another piece of business? Or did you buy this one fair and square?" The insult was a lit match tossed into gunpowder. Still, Caleb held his ground. "This has nothing to do with her. This is between you and me." "That's where you're wrong," Jed said, his hand drifting toward the pistol on his hip. "It has everything to do with her. It's about seeing if the great Caleb, the man who walked away from a fortune in blood money, is still the man he used to be." It happened in a blur of motion that was both terrifyingly fast and chillingly deliberate. Jed went for his gun. He was quick, but Caleb was a force of nature. His Colt Peacemaker seemed to leap into his hand. There was no flourish, no dramatic pause, just a single, deafening roar that echoed off the false front buildings. Jed stood frozen for a second, a look of pure shock on his face, a dark hole appearing in the center of his chest. He collapsed into the dust like a puppet with its strings cut. Silence descended upon the street, thick and heavy. Caleb stood over the body, the smoking pistol still in his hand, his face a mask of cold, hard granite. This was the man Jed had summoned. The butcher. The man who could kill without blinking, whose movements were stripped of all wasted motion, honed by a past steeped in violence. He slowly holstered his weapon, the sound of the metal sliding into leather unnaturally loud. When he finally looked up, his eyes found Lillian's. She was staring at him, not at the dead man on the ground. Her face was pale, her expression a mixture of shock and something else, a dawning, horrified understanding. She had seen the ghost. She had seen the swift, brutal, and deeply proficient violence he was capable of. The quiet gunman who had saved her and the cold-blooded killer were one and the same. The fragile bridge of trust they had built in the ruins of the mission now lay shattered in the dust of Redemption's main street. The echo of the gunshot, a chasm between them. He saw the question in her eyes. Who are you? It was a question he had spent years trying not to answer, even to himself. The gunshot that killed Jed Stone had also killed the fragile peace between Caleb and Lillian. The sheriff, a weary man who seemed more interested in avoiding paperwork than dispensing justice, had ruled it a clear case of self-defense after a few disinterested questions. But the judgment in Lillian's eyes was far more damning than any lawman's. Caleb was no longer her reluctant savior. He was a killer, plain and simple. He had meant to leave Redemption at first light, to put the town and its ghosts behind him. But the confrontation had left its mark. In the heat of the moment, he hadn't realized that one of Jed's cronies, hidden in the saloon's shadows, had gotten off a wild shot. A searing pain in his side now announced the bullet's presence, a deep graze that had torn through muscle and was bleeding sluggishly. He had tried to hide it, but a wave of dizziness as he saddled the roan betrayed him. He slumped against the stable wall, his face pale and beaded with sweat. Lillian found him there. She had been standing by the water trough, her posture rigid with indecision, clearly planning to go her own way. But seeing him wounded, seeing the vulnerability that cracked through his hardened exterior, she hesitated. He was the butcher of Black Creek Gorge, but he was also the man who had shared his water with her, who had listened in the firelight. "You're hurt," she stated, her voice flat, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. "It's a scratch," Caleb lied, his teeth gritted against a wave of pain. She stepped closer, her eyes assessing the dark, spreading stain on his shirt. "A scratch that's going to have you collapsing in the desert by noon." She looked around the squalid livery, then made a decision. "The hotel here is no good. Jed's friends will be watching it. We need a place." He was too weak to argue. She guided him, his arm draped over her shoulder, through the back alleys of Redemption, moving with a purpose that surprised him. She led him to the small, clapboard house of the town doctor, only to find a note on the door. "Gone to the Miller Ranch. Be back in 2 days." Lillian's jaw tightened. For a moment, he thought she would leave him there on the porch. Instead, she looked at the small, adjoining clinic, its window slightly ajar. "This will have to do." Inside, the room smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs. It was here that their roles completely, irrevocably reversed. She was no longer the rescued, the dependent. She was in charge. "On the table. Shirt off," she ordered, her voice taking on the calm authority of a person in their element. Wincing, Caleb did as he was told. The bullet had ripped a nasty, ragged channel along his ribs. It needed cleaning and stitching. Lillian washed her hands meticulously at the basin, her movements sure and steady. She searched the doctor's cabinets, finding what she needed: antiseptic, a needle, and silk thread. He watched her, a strange sense of dislocation washing over him. The woman he'd thought of as a victim moved with the confidence of a trained professional. "My mother," she said, as if sensing his unspoken question, her focus entirely on the wound. "The books I told you about, they weren't novels. They were medical texts, anatomy, botany. She wanted me to be a doctor." Her voice was quiet, full of a past that felt like another lifetime. As she began to clean the wound, her touch was firm and clinical, yet gentle. He flinched as the antiseptic stung, and her other hand came to rest on his shoulder, a steadying, grounding presence. "Hold still," she murmured. "This is the worst of it." For the next hour, she worked in focused silence, her brow furrowed in concentration as she stitched the torn flesh back together with small, neat sutures. He was completely at her mercy. The gunman rendered helpless, the healer in total control. In this raw, vulnerable state, the walls he had built around himself began to crumble. "Black Creek Gorge," he said, the words thick in his throat. It wasn't like he said. Lillian didn't stop her work, but he knew she was listening. "We were hired to clear out squatters. That's what the Baron told us. But they weren't squatters. They were homesteaders, families. On land the Baron wanted." His voice was heavy with self-loathing. "When we realized, it was too late. I gave an order to stand down. But men like Jed, they didn't want to stand down. It was a massacre. I killed men that day, but I never hurt a woman or child. I got this saving a boy no older than 10. He unconsciously touched the old Bowie knife scar on his leg. I walked away from the Baron and his blood money that day, but the name stuck." She finished the last stitch, tying it off with a neat knot. She didn't offer absolution or judgment. She simply looked at him, her green eyes clear and searching. She had seen the butcher, and now she had heard the man. She had tended to his wound, and in doing so, had touched the deeper wound he carried within his soul. As she bandaged his side, a new bond was forged between them, not of debt or rescue, but of shared vulnerability and a truth finally spoken. It was a fragile, tender thing. And it was at that exact moment that the sound of heavy horses and angry voices echoed from the main street. A man shouted Lillian's name, followed by a curse. "They've found us," Caleb said, trying to sit up. Lillian placed a hand on his chest, pushing him back down. "Stay put. You're no good to anyone like this." Her eyes, once defiant and cold, now held a glint of fierce, protective fire. The men who claimed to own her were here, but the woman they were hunting was gone. In her place stood a healer, a protector, and she was not going to let her patient be taken without a fight. The shouts from the street grew louder, closer. They were not the drunken taunts of men like Jed Stone. They carried the cold, professional menace of trackers who had found their quarry. Lillian quickly barred the clinic door, her heart pounding a steady, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Caleb, fighting waves of pain and weakness, managed to push himself into a sitting position on the edge of the examination table, his Colt resting in his lap. His face was ashen, but his gun hand was steady. "How many?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. "I saw 3 ride in," Lillian whispered, peering through a grimy pane of glass in the window. "They're talking to the sheriff, showing him a paper." One of the men, a tall figure with a long, gray duster and a cruel, thin mouth, separated from the group and began walking directly toward the clinic. He moved with an arrogant certainty. This was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Lillian," the man called out, his voice smooth but laced with iron. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I represent the interests of Baron Jacobs. We both know you are his property, legally acquired. Come out now. and we can avoid any further unpleasantness. Baron Jacobs. The name sent a chill down Caleb's spine. It was the same cattle baron he had worked for, the same man who had orchestrated the massacre at Black Creek Gorge. The disparate, ugly pieces of their pasts were suddenly slamming together. "Don't answer," Caleb breathed, his mind racing, trying to connect the dots through a fog of pain. Why would a man like Jacobs want her? "He thinks I'm property," Lillian said, her voice trembling with a rage that burned away her fear. "My own father sold me to him. He told me it was to settle a gambling debt." Thorne knocked on the door, a sharp, impatient rap. "Lillian, do not make this difficult. The man inside is a known killer. He cannot protect you. We have a warrant for his arrest, for the murder of Jedediah Stone. The sheriff has given us leave to execute it." It was a lie, a trap. They were using the law as a cudgel. Caleb knew in that moment they had to run. He looked around the small room, his eyes falling on a back window that led to a narrow, refuse-filled alley. "The window," he said. "We can make it to the canyon lands by dawn, if we can get our horse." "You can barely stand," she countered, her gaze flicking between him and the door. "You'll have to be my strength, then," he said, meeting her eyes. "Just for a little while." Their escape was a desperate, painful scramble. Lillian helped Caleb through the window, his wounded side screaming in protest. They moved through the labyrinthine alleys of redemption, staying in the shadows, every shout from the street sending a fresh jolt of adrenaline through them. They reached the livery, saddled the roan in frantic silence, and slipped out the back, heading not for the open road, but for the treacherous, broken country to the east, a place known as Widow's Whale Canyon. It was a maze of red rock and narrow passages, a place where a man could disappear if he knew the way. They rode through the night, Lillian in the saddle, Caleb seated behind her, his arms around her waist for support, his body racked with feverish shivers. He was a dead weight. The protector now, the protected. As the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky, they found a defensible spot deep within the canyon, a rock overhang that concealed them from above. Caleb slid from the horse, his strength gone. Lillian tended to his wound, which had begun to bleed again. It was in this quiet, desperate moment, with the threat of death closing in, that the final devastating truth was unearthed. "Baron Jacobs," Caleb murmured, his mind finally clear enough to piece it all together. "Your father. What was his name?" "Thomas Devereaux," she said, her hands freezing in the act of tightening his bandage. "Why?" Caleb's blood ran cold. Devereaux. He knew that name. "Thomas Devereaux was at Black Creek Gorge," he said, the words tasting like poison. "He wasn't a homesteader. He was one of the Baron's men, a planner. He helped set the whole thing up." Lillian stared at him, her face a mask of disbelief. "No, that's not possible. My father was a gentleman, a rancher." "He was the Baron's right hand," Caleb interrupted, his voice gaining a grim certainty. "After the massacre, when things got hot, the Baron needed someone to take the fall, someone to disappear the evidence. Devereaux was weak. He must have made a deal to save his own skin." The full monstrous truth bloomed in the space between them. Lillian hadn't been sold for a gambling debt. She had been the price of her father's silence. He had traded his own daughter to the Baron to cover up his involvement in a massacre, a final, damning piece of evidence to be hidden away or disposed of. And the bitterest irony of all was that Caleb, the man running from the ghosts of that same massacre, had stumbled into saving the one person who was living proof of that long-buried crime. His act of redemption had not been random. It had been fated, a collision of two lives inextricably bound by the same violent, treacherous act. The men hunting them didn't just want Lillian back as property. They wanted to permanently silence the last living link to the truth of Black Creek Gorge. The dawn broke over Widow's Whale Canyon, its light spilling over the red rock like blood and gold. The truth, raw and horrifying, lay between them, having stripped away all remaining illusions. Lillian sat beside Caleb, the revelation about her father settling not as grief, but as a cold, hard stone in her gut. The man she had once revered had sacrificed her to bury his sins. Caleb, weak and feverish, felt the circular, cruel nature of fate. He had tried to outrun his past, only to find it waiting for him in the eyes of the woman he had saved. "They'll come at sunrise," Caleb said, his voice raspy. "Thorn is arrogant. He'll think we're trapped, wounded." "We are," Lillian stated, but her voice held no despair. It was the voice of a woman who had lost everything and found something new in its place. "Resolve. Almost," Caleb corrected, giving her a faint, grim smile. He pushed a few loose cartridges for his Colt across the dusty ground toward her. "You know how to use one of these?" She looked at the pistol he kept as a backup, tucked into his saddlebag. "My father taught me to shoot at targets, not at men." "There's no difference," Caleb said. "You just have to remember what they're trying to take from you." A plan, born of desperation and their combined skills, began to form. It wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about reclamation. It was about facing the ghosts and making them pay. Caleb, the tactician, laid out the strategy. Lillian, the healer with her knowledge of the land, refined it. She knew of a plant that grew in the damp crevices of the canyon. Devil's breath, not lethal, but its pollen, when burned, created a thick, disorienting smoke that could incapacitate a man, causing confusion and choking fits. As the sun climbed higher, they heard the telltale clatter of hooves echoing through the canyon. Thorn and his 2 men were coming, fanning out as they approached the overhang. The moment was upon them. Lillian had already placed the Devil's Breath in a small, dry patch of brush at the narrow entrance to their alcove. As the first rider came into view, she struck a match and tossed it. The brush ignited with a whoosh, releasing a plume of thick, yellowish smoke. The man choked, his eyes streaming, his horse rearing in panic. It was the diversion Caleb needed. From his position behind a rock, he fired. Not a killing shot, but a precise one, hitting the man in the shoulder and sending him tumbling from his saddle. 1 down. The second rider, startled, wheeled his horse around, firing blindly into the smoke. Lillian, her heart hammering against her ribs, raised the backup pistol with both hands. Just as her father had taught her, she sighted down the barrel, held her breath, and fired at the man's horse. The animal screamed and fell, trapping the rider's leg beneath it. 2 down. Now there was only Thorn. He had dismounted, using the rocks for cover, his face a mask of fury. "You can't hide forever. Butcher!" he roared. "I'm not hiding anymore," Caleb yelled back, his voice surprisingly strong. He was running on pure adrenaline. He pushed himself to his feet, using the rock to steady his aim, and fired a shot that chipped the rock near Thorn's head, forcing him back. This was her chance. While Thorn was pinned by Caleb's fire, Lillian slipped out of the back of the alcove, circling around the rock formation with a silence and speed she didn't know she possessed. She emerged behind Marcus Thorn, the pistol held steady. "It's over, Thorn," she said, her voice clear and cold. He spun around, his eyes wide with shock. He saw her, no longer the frightened girl from Purgatory Point, but a woman forged in betrayal and fire. He sneered, raising his own pistol. "The Baron will hunt you to the ends of the—" He never finished the sentence. A single shot echoed through the canyon. But it wasn't from Lillian's gun. It was from Caleb's. He had used her as the ultimate distraction, taking the final precise shot from across the clearing. Thorn crumpled to the ground. Silence. The ringing in their ears slowly faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the canyon. It was over. The debts were paid. His in blood and lead under the rising sun, hers in the severing of a toxic past and the claiming of her own future. Caleb sagged against the rock, his strength finally giving out. Lillian rushed to his side, holstering the pistol and immediately pressing a hand to his reopened wound. He looked up at her, his stormy eyes clear for the first time. Free of the ghosts that had haunted them, she looked back, her own gaze steady and sure. They were scarred, battered, and exhausted, but they were free, together, under the warm morning sun. They had carved out a sliver of peace in a world that had offered them none. The weeks that followed were quiet. They found a small abandoned homestead nestled in a valley far from the Baron's reach, a place where the creek ran clear and the cottonwood trees rustled in the wind. The harshness of the desert gave way to a gentle, rolling landscape that seemed to promise a chance to heal. Caleb's body recovered slowly under Lillian's constant, practiced care. He spent his days repairing the small cabin, his hands, so used to the cold weight of a gun, learning the new language of a hammer and saw. The sounds of construction were a form of prayer, each nail driven a testament to a future he hadn't believed he would have. Lillian planted a garden. She tilled the rich soil with her own hands, planting seeds for vegetables and herbs, the kinds that nourished and the kinds that cured. She found a peace in the rhythm of it, in the simple, honest work of coaxing life from the earth. The ghosts of her past still whispered on the wind some nights, but their voices grew fainter with each passing day. She was no longer Thomas Devereaux's daughter or Baron Jacobs's property. She was simply Lillian, a woman of the valley. They didn't talk much about the past. They didn't need to. It lived in the silver scar on Caleb's leg and in the resolute strength in Lillian's eyes. It was a shared history that bound them more tightly than any vow. Their love wasn't one of grand declarations, but of quiet, everyday actions, the way he brought her a cup of coffee at sunrise, the way she would rest her hand on his shoulder as she passed him, the long, comfortable silences they shared on the porch as they watched the sun set over their valley. They had both been sold, in their own ways, betrayed by the lives they were supposed to lead. But in the desolate wilderness, in the face of death, they had not just saved each other. They had allowed each other to be saved. Finally understanding that true redemption isn't about erasing the past, but about having the courage to build a future in spite of it. They had found their sanctuary, not on a map, but in the quiet, resilient space between two scarred souls who had found their way home.